All right, so yeah, today, as Mason said, today I'm going to talk about a publication that I recently had accepted. Actually, it was about 2 years ago. It's called Everyday Racism in Integrated Spaces. I'm also going to try to talk a little bit about the larger research projects and the idea of racial campus climate more generally, and a little bit about sort of the behind the scenes work as well. You know, a lot goes into publishing something and we often don't talk about that. This publication has a lot of interesting politics. So I'm going to try to integrate a little bit of that into the talk as well. So thanks for having me. So first, I'm going to start with figuring out how to use my PowerPoint slides. Sorry, for some reason it's not advancing. Here we go. All right, so here's just a quick overview. I'm going to just kind of do some broad brushstrokes about the literature on diversity in higher education. Talk a little bit about the conceptual tools that we use, specifically racial microaggressions and racial campus climate. And talk about the study, how we went about collecting data and some of the results and just some of the implications and sort of takeaways from the research. So why diversity, equity, and inclusion? Why do these things matter in higher education? This is kind of, those are the driving sort of larger questions that I'm asking in this research. And just some background, why we care about diversity in higher education. Well, first of all, that in higher education, we have diverse students coming from a lot of different backgrounds. And so diversity does matter. The reality of our student population is that they're not all the same. Different social class, race, immigration status, gender, life experiences, and so on. Another reason why we care about diversity in higher education is that more and more employers are looking for students who can work with diverse groups of people. It's a soft skill. It's a hard one to teach and to measure, but it's actually really important, being able to collaborate, work in groups of people who have different experiences and opinions. Employers are looking for employees who are open to new ideas, who can see something from another perspective. And so, as an institution of higher learning, these things are really important. And as our classrooms become more and more diverse, we have to enable students to be able to work well together. There are also other benefits in terms of diversity, more intellectual ideas, more possibility for innovation and solving tough problems. And if you need a financial reason, many corporate sort of enterprises think about it increases their bottom line. So there's lots of arguments for why we should care about diversity in higher education. So universities, the big question is, are universities preparing students to work in this setting? Are students when they graduate prepared to work in a diverse work environment? And one of the arguments that I make in the paper is that despite efforts to create this inclusive, welcoming, multicultural space on a campus, campuses remain an unstable, contested, inequitable space because racial domination continues to endure in these spaces. And so that's what the article kind of breaks down, is how this institution that is very much about being a multicultural and inclusive space actually fails in many ways. And so diversity is obviously more than numbers. Just because you have diverse people sitting in the same classroom doesn't mean you have meaningful interaction. It doesn't mean that everyone feels included. And so I'm basically going to break that down for you and show how that plays out on one campus. Okay. So why should we care? And so specifically, I focus on racism and how that's a barrier, right? How that creates problems for students of color. And there are a couple of reasons why we care about racism in higher education. One of them is that it actually creates a barrier for diversifying the campus. So if your campus is known as a hostile place to students of color, it interferes with the university's ability to attract a diverse student body. It also interferes with their ability to retain those students. If you come to a campus, you don't feel welcome, you don't do well in your classes because you don't feel welcome, then you end up leaving or changing majors or not finishing. And so that's one reason. Another reason is that people have studied this, students actually do better academically when they feel they have a sense of belonging. So if not all of our students feel they belong on campus, that has direct implications for how well they do in their studies. And so we want students to do well, we want them to thrive. And so thinking about how racism impacts the sense of belonging on campus is really important. And finally, and this gets back to the earlier point, is that students aren't learning how to work together and work in places in their classroom with diversity, then how do we expect them to go out in the workplace and in society and get along and collaborate and problem solve with diversity? So there's lots of reasons why we should care about racism, in terms of learning, in terms of like how our society functions, how well our organizations run. And so this project focuses specifically on the idea of racial campus climate. So how does racial campus climate impact the experience of students of color on the campus? And so this idea of racial campus climate is not something that I came up with. This is an idea that was really coined by Sylvia Hurtado and a number of her colleagues and students. And it's this idea that, and I'll just read a quote from her work, which is, racial campus climate is the attitudes, perceptions, and expectations in an institutional community around issues of race, ethnicity, and diversity. So that says a lot, but it's things like, how do people interact with each other? What are the policies on campus? Are certain things enforced? What kind of programming there? What are the dorms like? How does the campus respond to racism, and so on? So all these things make up the racial campus climate. And normally, what more people are familiar with are the more extreme examples. So the things that we can point to and say, oh yeah, that's definitely racist. Someone says something that's very racist, or maybe there's some graffiti marked on a wall. Oh, that's racist. But what I'm trying to do in this research is show that that's actually just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot underneath that's going on that we don't always see as white people. We often don't see a lot of things that are happening because we're not sensitive, and we don't realize that there are a lot of more subtle processes going on. Okay. So the sort of a conceptual tool that we use is this idea of racial microaggressions. And that is, it really focuses on the kind of everyday interactions. So things, the way people talk to each other, the way that they behave, and other kinds of everyday, both conscious and unconscious, intentional and unintentional interactions and experiences that basically create a hostile, derogatory, and negate the experiences of people of color. And this concept was something developed actually for Daryl Wing Su, actually is most known for it, and he is based in psychology, but it was actually a concept that started much earlier. And it kind of came out right after the civil rights, where folks were thinking, oh yeah, we dealt with racism. And then there was this discussion about how there are a lot of things happening that you can't really legislate away, but that we're still impacting the experience of people of color in terms of how they felt included. A little bit about what racial microaggressions are, and then when I get a little bit more into the study, you'll hear to campus environment. So we use this. So we dig into. Sorry, I'm off the slide here. Here we go. So the racial microaggressions, it has a typology, and this is again from Daryl Wing Su. And so I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the examples he uses. So he talks about the idea of micro insults and micro invalidations and micro assaults. And a lot of times people get really kind of caught up on the term micro in terms of racial microaggressions. The idea of micro isn't that they're small and insignificant. It's that they often are every day, that they happen all of the time. And so they become micro in that sense that the dominant culture accepts them and doesn't see them, even though they're felt and experienced in a much more like macro way. And so that idea of micro, just keep in mind that it doesn't mean that racism is insignificant, but a lot of times the things that we're talking about in this study are just, they're not noticed by the dominant culture. So insults, I'll just say a few things. Insults is this idea of a hidden insulting and messaging towards people of color. So one example is, a white employer asked a prospective candidate of color, how did you get your last job? Sort of sometimes implying like, did you get your job because you're a person of color, or are you qualified? So it's like these messages that may sound on the surface as completely not racist, but then in the context feel that they are because that person gets asked the same kind of question over and over again. So if you're doing an interview and the employer says, oh, I believe the best person will get the job regardless of race, that kind of commenting can be considered a micro insult. While the intention isn't necessarily racist, the way it is experienced feels that it is racist. And that's really an important aspect of the racial microaggressions work, is that it's from the perspective of a person of color, not from the person who says or does something, but how those things are experienced. And that actually, sometimes people get really tripped up on that, but that's one of the things that we focused on in the study, was the experience of students of color, not the intention of students who were saying and doing things. So micro invalidations is another kind of microaggression that we looked at. And that idea is communicating things that exclude, negate, or nullify thoughts and feelings of people of color. So for example, a common example is someone making a comment like, I don't see color, we're all human beings. And that then negates experiences of a person of color, in a conversation, for example, or the assumption that everyone who is not white is from another country. Those sorts of things negate the experiences of people of color. Those are really common things that are actually said on a day-to-day basis. And then the idea of microassaults is typically a little bit more of like old-fashioned racism. It's more obvious. What is important about them is that there are things that become acceptable in a particular context, and they're tolerated even though everyone knows that they're racist. So for example, having a racial themed party, the university tolerates those kinds of parties that their students hold. They can't really enforce them, but everyone knows that it's racist, and it becomes an everyday practice of students getting together and hosting a racially themed party, which, if you don't know what that is students dressing up as if they're another racial group and kind of making fun and sort of drawing on stereotypes, negative stereotypes of different groups. Okay, so I want to shift to the study. So that's a little bit about some of the concepts we used in the study. The study actually was at my previous university where I worked, the University of Illinois. We basically came together. It was a group of us who were responding to some activities happening on campus. There was a lot of controversy around the mascot, and also a lot of controversy around racially themed parties, which I just mentioned. And specifically, during the academic year of 2006 and 2007, there was a racially themed party called Tacos and Tequila. One of the fraternities hosted that party, and then there was a big outcry about how that's really inappropriate, and that, why is the university supporting these kinds of organizations when they're clearly doing things that are racist? So there was a big protest, and then a bunch of faculty got together and just started talking about racism on campus, and we realized that actually there were a lot more things going on, not the obvious of the racial theme party, but things going on in the classroom, in student groups, in office hours of faculty, and we started digging into the racial campus climate. So the context of the study is, again, at the University of Illinois. It's what we call a predominantly white institution that is historically a majority white. It actually, at some points, they actually did not allow different kinds of people based on the racial category to come to campus. There was a time where, for example, African Americans were not allowed to live on campus. So it has a long history of exclusion, although now it's very diverse. It has this legacy of being racist. And so it's a 20% international population, 25% domestic persons of color on campus, and has about 45,000 to 50,000 students. So some of our research goals. So one was we got together, we formed this research team, and we decided to start this project. And we set up some research goals, which were, one was to just identify the types and experiences of racial microaggressions among students of color at the University of Illinois. We wanted to analyze the impact of this kind of campus climate. So specifically looking at how it impacted students of color. And then finally, we wanted to then educate the campus community about it. So we didn't only want to publish in academic journals, we wanted to actually do presentations and trainings and produce materials that other people could use in their classrooms and for training and so on. So it had like a very much a goal of making an impact beyond the academic world. So what we did, this is a project that actually started in 2006 and has continued. I'm less involved because I moved to the University of Utah over 3 years ago, but it started, so it started in 2006, we got together, and then by 2008, we did a small set of focus groups. So we started with the dorms, we did some focus groups, and then we had a second phase where we did more focus groups with students of color. We targeted specific groups. So for example, we did focus groups with students who are Asian American, and we did students who were Black. And then we even got deeper and we said, okay, we're gonna just look at women of color, or we're going to look at men, or we're going to look at undergrads. We even got as specific as African American female undergrads. So we got really specific because what we started learning is that all these various identities shape the kinds of experiences of racism and racial microaggressions that students had. And to kind of get to that nuance, we had to sort of break down these different groups. So we spent a number of years doing that. And then we went to another phase, which was we did an online survey of all students of color on campus. And we sent the survey to about, I think, 10,000 people, and then had about a 45% response rate for the survey. So the data collection went over a number of years. And in between all those things, we were producing reports and publishing and so on, and giving talks. I'm going to focus on the article and the survey, but very much the article is influenced by the focus groups. And I can talk about that if you're interested. So we did the survey, it was a web-based survey. We had, this is just a screenshot of the survey. We had all kinds of questions from very specific measures that have been tested by other researchers to exploratory questions. We had open-ended questions where students could fill in very detailed answers. So let's see, I'm just trying to think how much I wanted to say about the survey. I guess I wanted to say a couple things about the survey. There were 3 questions that we asked that were actually turned out to be very, very important for the study. We had 3 open-ended questions, and we asked students for their response for 3 types of events. So in addition to the quantitative, these 3 questions turned out to be like we got an incredible response. So one was, we asked students when they felt uncomfortable, insulted, and invalidated or disrespected by a comment with racial overtones. So we asked them to describe that event. What happened, who was there, what time it was, all kinds of details. We asked the students about when others had subtly expressed stereotypes, beliefs about their race or ethnicity. And then the third was when others have suggested that they did not belong at the university because of their race and ethnicity. So those were 3 open-ended questions. And normally when you ask open-ended questions, sometimes you don't get a lot of response. These questions produced a lot of comments. Students wrote a lot in those. So we were, at the time, when we started reading through the surveys, we were really surprised about how much students were writing. And then we realized that we kind of tapped into something that students didn't feel they had a voice. And this was an outlet in a way for them to express and to tell us about the experience of racism on campus. Let's see what else do I want to say really quick. Okay, the other thing I wanted to say here is that when we developed the survey instrument, we had a very interdisciplinary group of faculty and students working on it. So we asked a lot of different kinds of questions. And the question that I was really interested in was to ask questions about geography and space. And it was funny because you realize when you work in interdisciplinary groups that sometimes what you think is important is someone else doesn't think is important. And then, so we had these really interesting conversations about that. And I was able to insert a few questions about geography because I was like, we have to ask about particular things in a particular context. It's very important. We can't just look at what happened. We have to look at the context in which it happened. And so that's a lot of the focus of the paper. The publication, Everyday Racism, really draws from that sort of spatial location. All right. So just a real quick thing about recruitment. So how we did the survey. So we were able to work with the university. We got all the emails of everyone who was considered a domestic student of color. So that could be someone who was a US citizen, or it could be someone who had permanent residency in the United States. And that was around 10,000 students. And we emailed them. We created different kinds of samples so we could do some statistical things. So we had a random sample, we had a convenient sample, but we ended up sending the survey to everyone. And we really promoted the survey. So we did a lot of things that were unconventional. And if you're interested in like doing surveys and getting people to fill out surveys, we were really successful, but we did a lot of unconventional kinds of recruitment. We sort of like walked around campus talking about it all the time and went to classrooms, and we just told a lot of students about what we were doing and saying, check your email, we're going to send you a survey. And we use social media and all kinds of things. So yeah, it was really good. And then we held the survey open for a number of months and did 10 reminders, which was a little bit unusual, but it would enable us to get a really good sample. So I'm going to talk a bit about the survey results. So we have a couple of questions that we asked about that are kind of, we use as like sort of baseline indicators. So we have 4 questions here. One is, I have had stereotypes made about me in the classroom because of my race. So half of our sample said yes. But 1 out of every 2 students of color in the sample said, yes, this has happened, which to me suggests that it's a problem, right? That you would hope that this was something that seldom happened, but 1 out of 2 students said that it had happened to them. And then some other questions that we asked, or I had my contributions minimized in the classroom because of my race. 27% of the respondents, I have been made to feel the way I speak is inferior in the classroom because of my race. Also 27% of the survey respondents. And I have experienced not being taken seriously in class because of my race, 25%. So it's a lot of students of color feel that the classroom is a space where they aren't taken seriously, their ideas are dismissed, and they associate it with based on who they are. We were actually really alarmed by this because we thought, oh my goodness, you know, you have this notion of what the classroom space is, this open space, a space of ideas, space of debate, and then you begin to look at this and you say, well, is it really that open? You know, if students are feeling that they're being made fun of or that people aren't taking them seriously. So I'll talk a bit more about that, but when we presented these statistics around campus, it really was unsettling for a lot of people because, you know, it countered the narrative, the dominant narrative of the campus, which is, you know, we're diverse, we're inclusive, we're open, and then you have this sort of counter story emerging. Another thing that we just looked at specifically was where the location, where do you feel uncomfortable because of your race? And so these are the top items that came up. Fraternity and sorority was the #1 place that students of color felt most uncomfortable. And Green Street is just a commercial district with lots of restaurants and bars. The bus, classrooms and labs was pretty high. Resident halls, academic departments, and libraries. So a lot of spaces, students of color felt uncomfortable because of race. We also asked questions about places they avoid, and they avoided, so of this list, the things they avoided were things that they could avoid. It was harder to avoid the classroom. You know, it was harder to avoid your academic department, but a lot of times people actually said that they avoided them because they felt very uncomfortable in those spaces. So what the study does specifically, it begins to break down the kinds of spaces and how racial microaggressions influence those spaces. And we create these 3 types of spaces based on looking at both the quantitative and the qualitative data that we gathered. So we created this table that summarizes the 3 spaces. So I'll just spend a little bit of time on them. So the fortified space, the contradictory space, and the counter space were the 3 spaces. And the idea of the fortified space emerged. These were places where it was actually, racism was very explicit. It was not subtle. It was hostile. It felt dangerous for students of color. And these were spaces that were adjacent to campus oftentimes, but affiliated with campus. So they had a lot of freedom to do these even though you know, the campus didn't necessarily agree with it, right? So privately owned bars, fraternity and sorority houses, other kinds of spaces where this sort of behavior was tolerated and was viewed as, let's say, well, it's just in that one little area, you know, people would say, oh, okay, well, that's just that fraternity, or, oh, that's just that bar. So they were more privately owned sort of spaces but they were spaces of white dominance. And so we found lots of evidence of this idea of the fortified space. And here's, I'll just give you a quote from one of the students. I had, this is a student, he's in his first year. He says, I had a couple of friends and they wanted to go to a party, and we walked towards, one of the fraternities, and they said, hey, why are you walking this way? We don't want Mexicans. And the student's like, oh, whoa, I thought we were welcome on this campus, right? And this was, again, the student crossing over into a fortified space, not knowing, because they were new, right? The student was new to campus and had the belief that campus was inclusive and open. And then when the student entered a space that was a space where students of color were not welcome, immediately hit that wall and felt unwelcome. And then we have multiple examples of this where students felt endangered, they ran away, they had bottles thrown at them. They experienced racial, so these were these sort of fortified spaces. And then on the other end, we identified this idea of the counter space, which is the counter space is a concept that we didn't create the term counter space, that we draw from a number of people who write about spaces that are created as an act of resistance or survival. So students of color create these spaces as a way to feel that they belong, and also a way to deal with the opposition of students of color being on campus. So these kinds of things are, for example, cultural houses. It could be a club. It could be even a specific course where students of color feel very comfortable. It could be a professor's office. It could be a particular spot on campus where students hang out, in between classes. So they're both formal and informal spaces. And the idea is that they counter the feeling of not feeling welcome. And so there's the counter space, which is something that lots of people have talked about, but we even talked about how the counter space is resisted as well. So the presence of the counter spaces was controversial. So students of color would talk about how they would get together and people would call the police. And it's because they were gathering, and this was particular for African American men. They would say, yeah, we were just hanging out and the police show up. Or another group talked about how they wanted to form a student of color alliance group, and there was a huge backlash. And it's a great quote. This one student says, we got this backlash, and we're like wondering, we don't even have like a mission statement, and people were calling us a separatist group. And so this idea of the counter space, while it's super important for survival, it also is a contested space. And then finally, and this is the sort of main piece of the paper, is the idea of the contradictory space. And that is the space that the spaces that are central to the institution of higher learning, the classroom, the library, the office hours, the academic department, all of those things that make up the campus that are supposed to be open and inclusive for all students are the space of contradiction. And that is the thing that we really focus on. It's a covert space of racial dominance where students of color regularly experience feeling like they're a second-class citizen. And so that is the thing that we were really working on in this paper, was talking about the contradiction in the space on campus. And so we then further dove into this. So we identified the contradictory space, the space that is supposed to be open for all students, yet it feels like it's not actually very inclusive. And inclusion is negotiated, so it's conditional. You're, as a student of color, you're both hyper visible and invisible at the same time. It could even be in the same class period that you feel both those things. So we broke that down into a couple of sort of themes that I could talk about. I'll just say a little bit of it, and then I'll move on to a couple other things. So the idea of the contradictory space is, there are three themes. So one is the student of color feeling out of place. They feel disciplined in that space, and they shift in and out of the space. And so we go through a number of examples of how that works in the paper. So the idea of out of places could be simply, there aren't a lot of students of color in a classroom, and so they feel like the only one, or they don't feel comfortable and welcome, and they feel invisible in sometimes. The disciplined in space is like, okay, we're inclusive, but there are terms to that inclusion. For example, we want our classroom to be a diverse, but we're not actually interested in your opinion or your experience. And so when you talk in class, we're going to say it's not true. So this is a really powerful quote I have from one student saying, you know, they didn't want to listen to what we had to say. We, meaning students of color. One time I said it in class, do you know how difficult it is for me to be here right now? I'm not used to being in a class with white people ganging up on me. It makes me not want to talk in class. So this is a great example where it's conditional. You can be in our class, but we're gonna attack you when you say things that make us white people uncomfortable. I don't remember which major that was, but so it was that experience of the student really highlights this contradiction. And then the last one, the shifting in and out of space, is just this idea of like talking about how students of color move through space, and they're both visible and hypervisible. And this one example is where a student was talking about how he wears a baseball cap and how when he takes his cap off and on, he gets treated differently based on whether the cap is on or off. And so when he has the cap off and he wears his polo shirt, he talked about how people don't look at him. And then when he has the cap on, and he's dressed a little more casual, he's like automatically heads turn and they go, you're not supposed to be here. And so it's, again, this idea of like, you're here and you're not here, you're shifting in and out. Okay, so that's just kind of a summary of the research. I just want to say a couple other things about what we did. So we did, you know, the usual academic kind of thing of publishing, but we also produced reports that were full of quotes from students and that became widely circulated around campus. So we produced reports and printed them and sent them everywhere. We did press releases. We wrote in the local newspaper because we really wanted to get the word out. And it was in direct, you know, it kind of was in opposition to the messaging of the campus. And so, you know, not everyone was really happy about it on campus. And this is the rub with this kind of work, is that, you know, this is the kind of stuff that the university wants to put on their website and say, hey, look, we're doing a great job. Look at our researchers. And by the way, it finds that our campus isn't inclusive. And so it was kind of this interesting kind of like, everyone was excited, but at the same time, the campus was not excited. A couple other things. So when you do this kind of research, there's a lot of backlash to it as well beyond the campus. So we did this really big press release, and this is just a quick example of some of the negative responses that we received. So a lot of the alt-right kind of attacked us, very conservative right-wing kind of newspapers and blogs. I got some unpleasant emails, but mostly it was this kind of messaging. You know, this one here says, what a bunch of crap, you know, making fun of the idea, like of the racial microaggression. So, you know, this person says, you know, if I'm having a conversation with a mixed race group of friends and I mentioned briefly that I love fried chicken, that would constitute a microaggression. Shame on me, I'm a microaggressor, a very, very microaggressor. And so it's kind of poking fun at the work and not, I mean, obviously blogs like this really go a long way, but I just wanted to point out that this work also had this aspect to it. And then there was a lot of really positive things that happened, but those were more private conversations. So like really positive emails saying, thank you, I really appreciate it, I feel validated. You know, I graduated 30 years ago and it really resonates with me. So it was this sort of private, a lot of private conversations, and then the sort of public kind of bashing of researchers, you know, like, oh, what a waste of money, why would you spend state tax dollars on this? Of course, it wasn't paid for with state tax dollars, but so just a couple of final comments. So some takeaways. So inclusion is more than just having diverse people share a space. The research that we worked on really shows that racism, particularly the subtle forms, are not isolated incidents. They're actually very much ingrained in a campus culture. And that when campus culture is systematically hostile to students of color, they don't feel they belong, and it impacts their ability to do well on campus. Many students do well, but it just adds a lot of stress, and many students choose to go other places. A couple of other takeaways. So again, just because something is integrated and claimed as multicultural or inclusive, it doesn't mean it's not free of racism. It might be that you can't see it if you're not a person of color. Racism is what I call a spatial practice, and it's both explicit and subtle. And so it impacts the way students move through space, the way where they go, where they don't go, how they access services and information. And that's super important in terms of thinking about creating an inclusive campus. And so, if we're trying to create educational opportunities for all students, we have to think about racism. So just a couple of last things. This is a super duper collaborative project, very interdisciplinary. We've had faculty, undergrads, grad students from all different backgrounds and majors. And it would not have been possible without a very diverse team of researchers. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm just one of many voices, and none of us would have been able to do this work if we hadn't worked together on it. And finally, this is from Joe Fegan, who writes about the agony of education for students of color. He says, students must feel they belong and not like they have to fit in. And again, it kind of ties back to that idea of feeling that they belong versus that, oh, okay, I'm just gonna go along with things, but I'm not really welcome here. So I'll stop with that, and I look forward to your questions.